Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Lviv. I'm a campus advisor at Camera on Campus. We're going to have a really exciting event today with our camera fellow, Shannon Berzak, who I'll introduce in a moment. Before I do, I just want to remind people that we'll be doing this event in webinar format, which means that you'll be able to participate by asking questions in our Q&A function below. You'll also be able to write in the chat box, I believe, but Q&A function is the best place to do it. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce Shannon. And before I do, I just want to let everyone know that this will be an interactive discussion, and we hope you can ask some of the hard-hitting questions about Israel and the Middle East. We'll also be able to hear from some top student leaders from both the Young Democrats and the College Republicans as well, in addition to Shannon and Dr. Alex Safian. So without further ado, excited to introduce our camera fellow, Shannon Berzak, who has done an absolutely amazing job planning this event.
Hi, everyone. I'm humbled to be introducing Dr. Alex Safian. Dr. Safian is the Associate Director of Camera. His profound articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Jerusalem Post, and a plethora of other newspapers and academic journals. He has lectured widely on the media coverage of the Middle East and related issues. Dr. Safian is the author of PBS in Israel, a pattern of bias, the case of journey to the occupied lands, and has testified before an appropriations subcommittee of the U.S. Congress regarding bias in the PBS and NPR programming. Dr. Safian, thank you so much for taking the time to provide insight on the tough questions surrounding Israel to the students of the University of Miami. The floor is now yours.
Well, thank you very much, Shannon. My pleasure. Very happy to be with you all. Israel is often, in fact, usually misrepresented in the media and on many, many campus discussions. And that's why it's so important to learn the facts and to know how to frame the questions and the discussion when it comes to Israel. Israel is a liberal, progressive democracy surrounded by countries which are anything but, and surrounded by terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and even ISIS. Up until a few months ago, had a pretty strong presence in the Golan. And these are all, and of course, both Hezbollah and Hamas are closely tied to Iran, which is a very problematic country, unfortunately. I say that as someone who is of Iranian heritage, but Iran, under the current leadership, the Islamic Republic, is a very troublesome country that engages in a great deal of terrorism and targets Israel. Now, the myth on many campuses is that Israel is somehow bad. I mean, it comes down to that. Israel is bad. Almost no matter what Israel does, it's often portrayed in a very negative way. For instance, I'll jump ahead to the question of COVID-19 vaccines. Israel has done a tremendous job in vaccinating its public. They've vaccinated a higher percentage of their public than any other country in the world. This led to a joke on Saturday Night Live where the comedian said that Israel has vaccinated half its country. I'm going to bet it's the Jewish half. In fact, the vaccination within Israel is distributed according to the population among Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. There's been a very strong public relations campaign to get Arabs to buy into it. And in fact, Israeli medicine and pharmacies, et cetera, have a disproportionate number of Arab Israelis there, Arab Israeli doctors and Arab Israeli pharmacists. And so they've been used to speak directly to the Arab community to get the vaccine. And the same kind of effort is having to be done with the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, which also can be somewhat question the safety of vaccines. And so there's been an effort to get them to buy into it as well. So the joke was wrong, factually wrong, not very funny, but it exemplifies the problem that we face of how even good things in Israel are turned into criticism, are turned into bad things. And that's something that we always need to be careful about opposing. Usually Israel, when it's judged, is judged to be bad compared to perfection. And that's maybe the most important point. Never let Israel be compared to perfection, because compared to perfection, every country loses, every person loses. Compared to perfection, Norway is terrible, Sweden is terrible, Denmark is terrible, France is terrible. Any country would be terrible, but only Israel is compared to perfection. And that's why you never allow criticism to be Israel versus some perfect ideal standard. Those who insist on judging Israel by perfection do it for a reason, because they know that Israel will lose. Israel is always accused of violating international law, for instance, in fighting Hamas. Right now, we see cases before the International Criminal Court that are being brought forward regarding Israel's conduct in fighting Hamas, and that Israel supposedly has violated international law in fighting Hamas. Well, number one, you have to look at the facts of, has Israel violated international law? But there's again a deeper question, and that is, what country lives up to international law? What countries follow international law, for instance, in combat? Does the United States? Does Britain? Does France? The answer is no. You look at the leading Western democracies, and I don't know what other countries to compare Israel to, but compare Israel to the leading Western democracies, the social democracies of Europe. How do they conduct themselves in states of war? How does the United States, for instance, under President Obama or President Biden? Well, we have drone strikes on people that we are not really sure about who they are or what they are. They tend to be in very isolated areas, the tribal regions of Pakistan, for instance. And we claim that we only kill combatants, that we never hit civilians, but we never know because we're not on the ground and nobody there is to check on the ground to see whether or not we got the right person. I know when we were going after bin Laden, we killed a number of tall Afghans who kind of looked like bin Laden from the point of view of a drone. They were not bin Laden, obviously. We didn't kill bin Laden with a drone strike. But we killed a number of innocent people because they kind of looked like bin Laden and we were rather eager to get bin Laden. So that's what we do. Again, comparing Israel to perfection is wrong. Compare Israel to the United States or to Britain or to France, and you see that Israel does better than any of these countries. For instance, Israel, before it launches a strike in Gaza, will often launch warnings. They will call up on the telephone. They know the telephone numbers of local residents. They'll call them up on their cell phones and tell them, get out of this building, we're about to hit it. They sometimes drop an empty bomb on the top of the building before they drop real bombs, so there'll be a noise and people will know to get out. No other country does this. Never, no other country ever does this to warn people before a strike that's going to hit a particular apartment building in a building, a particular, I should say, unit in a building. So that's the standard that Israel holds itself to. Israel comes closer to meeting the standards of international law than any other country in the world. And yet the UN's ridiculous Human Rights Council has more resolutions condemning Israel than all other countries in the world combined. As some have said, that if you were a Martian coming down to see what the world is like, you'd think that Israel is the worst country in the world. And Israel is the only problem in the world. No other countries are bad, only Israel. Judging by the Human Rights Council, that is what you'd have to believe. I'd also say never let Israel be judged by its worst citizens, because every country has bad people. There's no question about that. Even the best countries have crazy, immoral people. So I'll give you an example. In July of 2015, in retaliation for the murder of a Jewish settler firebombed a Palestinian home in the West Bank village of Duma, killing the parents and an 18-month-old child. Terrible. He was arrested. His accomplice, who actually didn't take part, who backed out in the actual event, but had helped the perpetrator beforehand, was arrested, and the perpetrator was arrested. The person who helped him was a minor, so he was sentenced, I believe, to 5 years in jail as a minor. The perpetrator, who is not a minor, who's a settler, was convicted and sentenced to 3 life terms plus 20 years. On the other hand, when Palestinians kill Israelis, they don't get sentenced to terms. They don't get sentenced to jail. They get rewarded. They get stadiums named after them and soccer fields and hospitals named after them. Their parents or their relatives get pensions from the Palestinian Authority. They get rewarded. In fact, the more Jews they kill, the higher the pension. Now, this is so bad that there was a young American, not Jewish, named Taylor Force, a West Point graduate, who was in business school, and he was in Israel on a class trip, and he was murdered in Tel Aviv by a Palestinian terrorist who stabbed him to death. The Palestinian was shot to death by police right at the scene, and his family was rewarded with a pension. Well, this enraged people here in the US, and so we passed into law the Taylor Force Act, and was signed into law by the president. And it says that basically 1/3 of aid to the Palestinians is going to be held back. They're not going to get it from the US until they stop rewarding terrorists. And the Palestinians refuse. So that aid has been held back under law from the Palestinians because they refuse to stop rewarding terrorists. So that's the big difference. There was also a case, that's an example of the big difference. There was also a case where a rabbi and his family were attacked while driving in the West Bank, and the car crashed. A Palestinian, husband and wife, happened upon them driving by. The wife was a doctor, and so they rendered assistance and called for an ambulance. And they helped the Israeli survivors until the ambulance got there. Well, the Palestinians were then threatened. It became impossible for them to live in the West Bank. They had to leave their village, and Israel had to give them asylum. So the whole family came to Israel, and they got temporary residence permits. When those temporary permits were expiring and they had no place to go, there was a large movement among the settler population to give them permanent residence. That's what Israel did. Those Palestinians got permanent residence in Israel because their crime was helping Israeli victims of a terrorist attack. So that is the difference, and that is what you have to keep in mind. The bottom line is that when a fair human rights comparison is made, Israel has no equal in the world. Now, as I said earlier, a major current issue is vaccines for the Palestinians. Does international law require Israel to give vaccines to the Palestinians? There are many people who say that Israel is required to give vaccines to the West Bank and to Gaza, Palestinians there, and that the fact that they don't is a sign of apartheid and discrimination, and that Israel is a racist state. In fact, some members of Congress have said that. Rashida Tlaib and I think Ilhan Omar and maybe even Betsy McCollum have said that, that this is a sign of the racist apartheid Israel. But does Israel have an obligation under the Geneva Conventions, for instance, to vaccinate the Palestinians? The answer is no. The relevant section of the Geneva Conventions is Article 59. I won't read the whole thing, but what it says is that Israel has the responsibility to allow supplies of vaccine to be sent to the Palestinians, to the West Bank and to Gaza. They're not supposed to stop the Red Cross or Saudi Arabia or anybody else or Russia, for instance, from providing vaccines to the Palestinians, which of course they're not. Israel's not doing that. But Israel's under no obligation in any sense to be vaccinating the Palestinians or to providing vaccine to the Palestinians. They're not under that obligation any more than they were under obligation to provide flu vaccines all these years to the Palestinians. And they didn't. They allowed the Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations to provide supplies of flu vaccines to the Palestinians. And furthermore, ever since the signing of the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians agreed they would be responsible for their own health care. The Palestinian Ministry of Health has been the go-to office that got the vaccines and distributed them to Palestinian health clinics at hospitals, etc. So the idea that Israel suddenly has an obligation that it hasn't had for the last 50 years is ridiculous. That is simply not true. And so one should not allow Israel to be subject to that kind of criticism without answering it. Now, you asked me personally if Israel had extra vaccine, should they supply it to the Palestinians? My personal opinion is yes, for various reasons. For one thing, a virus running rampant in the West Bank and Gaza, especially the West Bank, is very problematic for Israel because those people come legally and illegally into Israel. And the more people that actually are infected with the virus, the more chance there is for the virus to mutate into something even more dangerous, or that vaccines won't treat effectively. So for that reason, and for other reasons, if Israel had extra vaccine, I think they should provide it as much as possible to the Palestinians, but they don't have extra vaccine at this point. So that question is moot. Now, before going to questions, actually, I think I'll go to questions rather than, well, let me instead of going to the video that I was going to show, I won't show the video, but I was going to show a video of a very anti-Israel event. But rather than go through the video, I'll just answer a few of the issues that get brought up in video and on college campuses. So one thing is the occupation illegal? The Israeli occupation, to the extent that it still exists, is it illegal? And the answer is no. Occupations are not illegal. Occupations, as a result of a war, are perfectly legal until there is a peace treaty. And the peace treaty then between the parties determines the extent of the withdrawal and what happens after the withdrawal. For instance, after World War II, or actually during World War II, when we crossed Germany's sovereign borders, we began to occupy Germany, sovereign German territory, until we finally got to Berlin, along with the Russians and the British, etc., and the war ended. Was our occupation of Germany illegal? Of course not. Not illegal. We were not obligated to turn around the second we crossed the Rhine River and go back from where we came. The answer is no. So occupations are not illegal. The Israeli occupation is not illegal until the Palestinians, Israel was occupying Egyptian territory until the entire Sinai, until there was a peace treaty. And with the peace treaty, Israel withdrew. That's what happened. So when there's a peace treaty, finally, with the Palestinians, they'll decide where the border is, and the Israelis will withdraw to wherever that border happens to be. That's a subject for negotiation. But the occupation, the presence of Israelis, Israeli soldiers, etc., across the Green Line, which is not a border anyhow, which is just an armistice line, is not illegal. Now, another question is Israel apartheid? I'll give you one great example of how Israel is not apartheid. A number of years ago, the Israeli president, Moshe Katsav, was charged with sexually harassing assistants for a very long time, going back to when he was a politician. He was in the parliament, and then as president, he was accused of sexually harassing his aides. He denied it. He was offered a plea bargain. He denied it. He went to court. He lost. In the lower court judge was an Israeli Arab. So the president of Israel was found guilty by an Israeli Arab. He appealed to the Supreme Court. The judge that was on that three-judge panel that decided his guilt, that confirmed his guilt, was also a different Israeli Arab Supreme Court justice. So in Israel, you had Israeli Arab judges and Supreme Court justices that found the Israeli president guilty and put him in jail. That's the apartheid Israel, which obviously makes rubbish of any idea that Israel is an apartheid country. I also want to talk about, finally, there is sometimes the claim that there are Jewish-only roads in Israel and in the territories. And the fact is there are no Jewish-only roads. Absolutely no Jewish-only roads. There are, however, Israeli-only roads in the West Bank because of attacks on Israelis by Palestinians on the roads. There are some roads that have been restricted to Israelis, but they are disproportionately used by Israeli Arabs who are going to visit relatives, going shopping, etc. I want to conclude by just showing part of a PowerPoint. So I'm not going to show the video, but I'm going to show part of a PowerPoint. Let's see if I can get this here. And let me go forward, skip past that, and go over here. And see if I can start it over there. Nope, let me get the video. So Route 443 is one of those allegedly Jewish-only roads in the West Bank. And as you can see, this is a picture of the gas station. You can see the Hebrew and the Arabic. Now, if it's Jewish only, why are there Arabic signs? This is a picture I took of one of the customers inside that store, and you can see that she's obviously a Muslim. Now is a picture of the roadway. You can see on the left an Israeli Jeep. You can see a car, and I'm going to zoom in on the car in just a minute. But you also see behind that, you can probably make out that that's an Arabic van. It's a minibus for Arabs on Route 443, which is supposed to be Jewish only. Now here's the car, and you can see this obviously is not Jewish only. So the supposed Jewish only road, Route 443, which is one of the main examples of a Jewish only road, even according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and we got them to correct that, is not Jewish only. However, there are roads that are restricted to one religion in the Middle East. The road to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. They have these highway signs, and you can see on the left, Muslims only, the road to Mecca. There's another one, Muslims only on the left, and then you have to turn off to Riyadh, obligatory for non-Muslims on the right. And here is the Saudi Arabian Travels Information website, which says specifically, Mecca and Medina hold special religious significance and only persons of the Islamic faith are allowed entry. It says that on the Saudi Arabia Travels Information site. So that is, let me see if I can get out of here. There we go. So that's an example of the Jewish only road claim, which is totally false, but you can always turn the tables and say, well, there are roads that are restricted to certain religions in the Middle East. It's in Saudi Arabia. Okay, I'll stop there and start taking questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So the questions are coming in now, but I'm going to start off asking, and then Andrew, who is the president of the Young Republicans at the University of Miami, will be going next, and then Rachel, who is the treasurer of the Young Democrats at the University of Miami, will be going after. My first question is just like an all-encompassing question. What are the main factors that are preventing a conflict resolution between the Israeli and Palestinian leadership?
Well, I would say the Palestinians have to want peace. The problem is that the Palestinians have turned down peace treaties a number of times. Certainly in 1948, there was a partition resolution, and the Jews accepted it, the Arabs refused it, and started a war in which 1% of the Jewish population was murdered. I mean, you think about 1% of the population in this country would be over 3 million people. That is one bloody, costly war. Over 6,000 Jews were murdered in that war that led not to peace, but to armistice agreements, unfortunately. Now, they also were offered, I'll skip over some, I mean, there were other chances for peace, but the most notable, of course, was the period under President Clinton at Camp David, where there was a peace offer on the table, the Clinton parameters. And the Israelis accepted the very difficult compromises that Bill Clinton came up with. Arafat refused it. He said no. However, the night before, the Palestinian negotiators were sure that Arafat would say yes. They were celebrating because they thought there was finally going to be peace and a Palestinian state. So they were celebrating. But Arafat surprised them and said no, that he would never agree to this peace. And he went back and he started the Intifada, the second Intifada, which is very, very bloody. Thousands of Israelis were killed because he was not willing to make peace with Israel. And he wanted to make that very, very clear. He's at the end of Clinton's term, he said to Bill Clinton, and this is in Bill Clinton's book, President Clinton's book, that you're a great man. And Bill Clinton said, no, I'm a failure, and you made me a failure. Now you're going to have to deal with Ariel Sharon, who became the Israeli prime minister when Barak was defeated because of the failure of Camp David, because of the concessions that he offered that were refused, and the violence that started afterwards. Barak was defeated by Ariel Sharon. So that's what Clinton said to him. You made me a failure, and you're going to have to deal with Ariel Sharon now. And then, of course, under Ehud Olmert, the prime minister afterwards, 8 years later, there was a even more extensive peace offer that Olmert put on the table. And Arafat had died by then, but Mahmoud Abbas, the current Palestinian leader, he was the leader then as well, as we say, he's in his 15th year of his 4-year term. He received the peace offer from Olmert, and he said that he would come back the next day with his answer, and he never came back. He never gave a counteroffer. He never said yes. He never said no. He never said anything. He just ghosted Olmert and left. And this is not what I say. This is what Olmert says in an interview in the Israeli newspaper Arts, but it's exactly what Abbas said in an interview in the Washington Post by Jackson Deal. So both sides agree that Abbas simply walked away. He was not willing to accept the peace offer from Olmert, which everyone thought was a great extensive peace offer. It included a limited right of return. It included division of Jerusalem, a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. Everything the Palestinians supposedly wanted, even Abbas turned down. So until there's new Palestinian leadership, I don't think there's much hope for peace. There has to be a radical change among the Palestinians in order for there to be peace.
Thank you. Andrew?
All right, so just want to thank you, Dr. Safian, for coming on. Really appreciate it, and thank you, Shannon and David, for making this all possible. So my question: so we obviously can't deny, we can't deny that there's a very new brand of politicians, branded as progressives, that have taken American politics by storm recently. That being said, it seems that a new brand of anti-Israel sentiment has become somewhat mainstream among these up-and-coming politicians like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, etc., who've been known to spread misconceptions about Israel on social media to further, those sort of sentiments. What can we do as college students to ensure that this anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiment doesn't trickle down and spread onto our campus communities?
Well, good question. I would say also, I think, not to defend AOC, but I think she's not quite as bad as the other people you mentioned. She's not quite where the other people you mentioned are, like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. But you can look at the veterans like Betty McCollum as well. She's pretty awful also, and she's not of that generation of the young progressives. It is a real problem. It is a real problem, and you see it in the culture. You see it on Saturday Night Live when that so-called joke was made about the vaccination. As the saying goes, that politics is downstream from culture. So the culture is a problem, and the politics is a problem. But I think the only way to fight it, I think, is with the facts, not just sort of robotically saying, no, that's not true, here's the facts. By doing that, plus by presenting a broader theme, by reframing the question, by saying that Israel has offered peace multiple times, but the Palestinians have turned it down. Are you aware of all the peace offers that the Palestinians have turned down? Put the onus on the other side. Let them say, well, it wasn't a fair peace offer. Well, why not, right? At a public meeting where they claim, well, it wasn't a fair peace offer. At first, they deny that there was any peace offer. Then they say, well, it wasn't a fair peace offer. What was unfair about it? It was accepted by the Palestinian negotiators. It was accepted by President Clinton. What was unfair about it? A limited right of return for the Palestinians, where actually there's no real legal right of return, but a limited right of return for Palestinian refugees, a division of Jerusalem to make a Palestinian state, free passage between the West Bank and Gaza. What's wrong with that? Unless you don't accept Israel's right to exist at all in any borders, which some of them don't, of course. But get them to admit that. Get them to admit that what they actually want to see is the destruction of Israel. I think that if you do that, there are a fair number, I think quite a few people on campus who are not so involved on one side or the other, who will be repulsed by that. In fact, I remember quite a while ago, Alan Dershowitz on campus speaking to a large audience of students saying, so among the pro-Israel supporters, among the Jewish supporters, how many of you favor a Palestinian state? And they all put their hands up and said, yes, I favor Palestine. He said, okay, among you Palestinian supporters, how many of you support a state, a state of Israel? None of them put their hands up. That was telling. because that showed that they didn't support peace. It wasn't Israel's human rights record or this or that detail about Israel that they really cared about. That was just a pretext. Really, they just didn't accept the existence of Israel in any borders. Get them to admit that. And I think we win if you get them to admit that.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
I think Rachel.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for inviting us. I actually have 2 questions, if that's okay. They're unrelated, so I can just give them to you one at a time. First, how do you feel about Biden's policies on the Iran nuclear deal and how this may affect Israeli relations with the Middle East?
Good questions. Well, I think going back to the JCPOA is a bad idea. I think it empowers Iran, and I think it's a very deal. It's very favorable to Iran. And in fact, if you look when President Obama started talking about negotiating with Iran, he laid down certain markers, certain requirements that any deal would have to have, like no enrichment, no missiles that could deliver nuclear weapons. But that's not what the deal said, because he wanted a deal so much that he gave in. He allowed enrichment, and he allowed the creation of missiles that can reach not just Israel, but can reach Western Europe. And if Iran has a bomb and has missiles that can reach Western Europe, they will use that to intimidate Western Europe as well, if necessary. I'm not sure if necessary. So I think it's a bad deal. I think it's a very bad idea to empower Iran. However, the very ill-advised buddying up of the United States and Iran under the Obama administration, and if it continues in the Biden administration, is actually what led the Arab countries to get closer to Israel, right? I mean, the whole reason that all these Arab countries have started to have relations with Israel, United Arab Emirates is just written about today in the New York Times, Tom Friedman's column, you know, Bahrain and not Bahrain, but other countries, Saudi Arabia possibly. Why did they start having relations with Israel? The answer is because they were spooked by the Iran deal. And so if the United States is not going to protect them from Iran, if the United States is going to favor Iran, they were so worried, they said, well, we better turn to Israel because Israel opposes the Iran deal. And Israel, despite everything they've said all the years, is no threat to us. They're admitting that Israel was never a threat to the Arab countries at all. They view Israel as a strong country, a country that still has strong support in the US, and that can help protect them against Iran. And so they figure they better form an alliance with Israel. So I think the United States resurrecting the Iran deal may force the Arab countries to become even closer to Israel, many of them. We'll see. The other possibility, however, is they decide to cut a deal with Iran. If they get too scared and they don't think Israel can protect them, they may end up just cutting a deal with Iran and trying to appease Iran. We'll have to see. It would be a tragedy if the Abraham Accords ended because of the blunder of resurrecting the Iran deal by the United States. That would be truly a tragedy.
Great, thank you so much. And then my second question is, how can pro-Israel groups on college campuses work to foster positive relationships with Muslim and Middle Eastern students?
Well, that's difficult because they have to buy in, right? They have to agree. Now, if you're with students from the United Arab Emirates, you know, I think you should appeal to those students if you can find them. Students from these countries that have just made peace with Israel or have relations with Israel, they may be willing. I would say, unfortunately, although Israel has peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, those treaties are really top down. They have not penetrated to the population. And so you're not going to find many Egyptian or Jordanian students on US campuses who are going to be willing to talk to you. But students from Saudi Arabia might be, students from United Arab Emirates might. So, you know, there are possibilities. I've heard that Al Jazeera is actually starting, out of Qatar, is actually starting a conservative website, a conservative web news site for some reason. I mean, who knows, you know, I mean, I guess they see a market there, so they're going to try to do that. So it's possible even that Qatari students would be, willing to make common cause. And you can speak about, for instance, economic relations between Israel and United Arab Emirates. So you could do an event, for instance, on the budding economic relations between Israel and these Arab countries. You could even get speakers, perhaps, from some of these Arab embassies to come talk about relations with Israel. It'd be hard to boycott that. Some people might try, but it'd be hard to boycott that. There's tremendous good news from Israel. A lot of times we look at all the crises and the difficulties, but Israel, as you know, the Middle East is a very, very arid region which has serious water problems, but Israel has solved its water problems. I remember going to Israel, 5 or 10 years ago, and there'd be little signs in the hotel saying, there's a big water shortage. So if you want to keep your towels, leave your towels on the rack. But if you want to change your towels, put them on the floor. If you want to keep your bedding, please, put this sign on your bed that will keep your bedding in order to save water. Well, you don't see those signs anymore. Not because the rains have come necessarily, though they had a fairly decent rain year last year, I think, but because Israel is now the world leader in recycling water and in converting salt water to fresh water through reverse osmosis plants. Now that should appeal to progressive students, that Israel is the world. Israel recycles over 80% of its municipal sewage and reuses it in agriculture, thereby freeing up equivalent amounts of water for freshwater use. So you try to not use fresh water in agriculture, drinking water, use that for people, and recycle the municipal wastewater. That's, as I said, Israel's over 80%. The next highest, I believe, is Spain at about 18%. California, which has a huge water crisis, huge water shortage, spends nothing almost on recycling. They could solve their water problems if they started to recycle municipal wastewater and used it for their very, very important agriculture. Unfortunately, they're not doing that. So you can have an event, for instance, about recycling of water in Israel, and how this is a game changer for many, many countries, and how it's the most environmentally sound thing you could do. You might be able to get some progressive environmental groups to come in on that. Maybe not, maybe, who knows? But I know that these Arab countries are very, very interested in Israeli recycling of water and the reverse osmosis, the desalination plants. They're very interested in that. They're signing contracts right now. I just heard that the Israeli water company just signed a contract, or starting negotiations for a contract with United Arab Emirates to bring that Israeli technology to that country. So those are those kind of issues, and we can talk privately, about other ideas. The campus staff, I'm sure, has lots of ideas where you could create common cause around certain issues and kind of break some of the barriers that way. Okay.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, now we're going to start taking some questions from the audience. So one of the first questions was, what has Israel done to improve the West Bank's economy?
Well, a great deal, if you look at the numbers for agriculture, for instance, in the West Bank, it's increased tremendously. It's had some of the highest rates of increase in the world. If you look at the amount of drinking water available for the West Bank, it's increased, I think, by 600% per person. So forget about just the population increase, but per person, despite very large population increases, it's over 600% increase in the amount of drinking water, because Israel laid water pipes, laid water mains, and offered it to Palestinian communities, that they could have water pipes, so they'd have running water rather than rely on wells and cisterns. They would actually have running water for the first time. And many, many Palestinian communities accepted this and are hooked into the Israeli system, so they get water both from Palestinian West Bank sources, but also directly from Israel. So Israel sends about 40 million cubic meters of water per year to the West Bank. Over 10 million cubic meters just from Ramallah, which is pretty much, I would guess, the largest, certainly the most modern Palestinian city in the West Bank, where people have basically a Western lifestyle with washing machines and dishwashers, etc., and high-rise buildings. And they get a lot of water from Israel. Not all of it. They have their own sources as well, but they get a lot from Israel. Now, Palestinian communities that don't have running water, you often hear, look, I'll be frank, you'll hear sob stories in the media about this poor Palestinian community doesn't have water, and while the Israeli settlement next to it has water. Well, ask them if they turned down being hooked into the Israeli water main system that Israel built for the Palestinians. If they did, and they did, then their lack of water is their choice, unfortunately. It was a bad choice, and bad choices have bad consequences, but it was their choice. So Israel's done a great deal. And the West Bank economy is far, far better, both in terms of agriculture, in terms of industry. Israel brought in a minimum wage where there wasn't a minimum wage beforehand. So Israel brought in a minimum wage to the point where eventually Palestinians who are working in Israeli settlements, Israeli communities in the West Bank and in industrial zones were getting at least, they were under the same minimum wage law. So they were getting paid at least as much as Israelis were getting paid in Israel according to the minimum wage. And they were usually getting more than the minimum wage. So that's what Israel did. Now, interestingly enough, when the Oslo Accords came and Arafat came in and he had control of Area A and Area B, the first thing he did was he canceled all the Israeli laws, all the changes that Israel made to the laws, including the minimum wage. So there was no more minimum wage anymore. So Palestinians not working in the settlements and Israeli industrial zones went back to not having a minimum wage. That was not Israel's choice. That was the Palestinian choice, unfortunately. And look, there's no doubt the Palestinians have suffered a great deal through the years, but they've suffered because of the leaders that they've chosen or that they've agreed to live with. Leaders who wanted peace have basically been assassinated. Leaders who wanted war have been in charge. Until they find leaders who want peace, I don't see how their lives are really going to improve.
Okay, another question. I am always hearing about Israel's blockade on Gaza. Are they responsible for the terrible conditions there?
Well, there's not really a blockade. What there is Israel insists that it check what comes in through its border, and that's not the only border with Gaza. Gaza also has a border with Egypt at Rafah. But Israel tries to insist that it inspect what comes in so that weapons, explosives, and other dual-use goods are not allowed in. Certainly, there's no shortage of food coming in, of medicine coming in. Palestinian citrus can leave, can be exported, etc. Unfortunately, Hamas has taken to bombing the export places where, the border crossings, where the Palestinian citrus is supposed to be exported. And so it's very difficult to do those exports if the Palestinians are attacking the transit points. But the reason that Gaza is in very bad shape is because Hamas is the leader of Gaza. They expelled the Palestinian Authority rather violently. They even threw some of their officials off of high buildings, among other ways of killing them, when they overthrew the Palestinian Authority and kicked them out. And they waste massive amounts of money on building attack tunnels, on building massive tunnels using cement that should have been used to rebuild buildings, to build roads. Instead, they steal that aid and they use it to build tunnels, trying to tunnel under the border into Israel so they can attack Israel, forcing Israel to develop sort of the first in the world techniques of actually detecting the tunnels from above ground. So Israel has developed technology to detect the tunnels and then to destroy them. So it's been a massive waste of money by the Palestinians, by Hamas, that could have been used to improve the situation in Gaza. But they were never interested in improving the situation in Gaza. They're not interested in the welfare of their people. If they did, they would stop attacking Israel, and they would at least have a truce with Israel. If you exchange the population of Gaza with Singapore, for instance, you brought all the people from Singapore into Gaza, there'd be no more attacks on Israel. Within a day or so, there'd be a lot of trade. There'd be factories set up in Gaza. There'd be all kinds of hotels and resorts and joint projects, etc., between Israel and Gaza. Because Gaza is not the problem. It's the Palestinian leadership that's the problem. And if the Palestinian leadership would get out of the way, then the Palestinians could reach a modus vivendi with Israel, even if it were only a truce. and life would be much better on both sides. You know, the people in Sderot wouldn't have to worry about missiles coming in with 15 seconds or 10 seconds of warning. And Israel wouldn't have to then retaliate against the factories that make the missiles. Be better for everybody.
Great. Multiple questions have been asked, so I'll try to put this one together. Where do you stand on the question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and how do you draw the line, if there is?
Well, I think there could be a line, but I think in general, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, because you are denying the right of the Jewish people, alone among all peoples of the world, to having a nation state. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And if you deny the rights of the Jews to have a state, but you are all in favor of a Palestinian state, then the question is, why? Why should the Palestinians have a state and not the Jews? Why should the Jordanians have a state, which, by the way, was carved out of land that was originally intended for Israel, part of the Palestine Mandate, carved by the British, out of that territory? So 80% of the original territory of the Palestine Mandate was carved out to create an all-Arab majority Palestinian state of Jordan. If you think that all these states should exist and all these peoples should have states, why not the Jews? Why are the Jews alone among the people who should not have a state? I'm all in favor, for instance, of a Kurdish state. There is not a Kurdish state right now. The Kurds are sort of spread around various countries. Iraq and Iran and Syria has a lot of Kurds. Israel has some Kurds, Jewish Kurds who fled to Israel. I'd be all in favor. I don't see why there isn't a Kurdish state. I'm all in favor of a Kurdish state. There's essentially a de facto Kurdish state in Iraq right now, but not officially. And so why should all these states exist but not a Jewish state? I think those people have a problem with Jews. So yes, I think it is anti-Semitism.
And going off that, so does the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism silence legitimate criticism of Israel? And what do you think on that?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it silences legitimate criticism at all. I think it tries to stop demonization, comparing to Nazis or to Hitler, basically trying to, it basically tries to stop the denigration of Israel, the dehumanization of Israelis, which is the first step towards destruction, right? The first step to a country being ripe for destruction is to dehumanize, to say they're less than human, which is exactly what anti-Semitism does. Anti-Semitism says that Jews are less than human. Jews are uniquely evil. Therefore, exterminating the Jews is not out of the question because they are uniquely evil. They are cosmic evil, to use the term of Bernard Lewis, the great scholar who died a few years ago, the great Middle Eastern scholar Bernard Lewis of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, said that anti-Semitism attributes to Jews cosmic evil, evil above all others. And that is the reason, I think, that the IHR definition is actually good, because it tries to prevent the demonization, tries to prevent people from getting on that road to demonizing Israel and thereby demonizing Jews.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question: does Israel allow freedom for religion for minorities?
Yes, sure. More than that. Because of the inherited system in Israel, the government actually pays for religious officials and religious buildings. So, for instance, Muslim leaders in Israel get a government salary, as do Jewish, rabbis, etc. But I shouldn't say Muslim leaders, Muslim religious leaders, qadis, etc., are on the government salary under the, this is a system inherited from the Turks way back when, from the Ottoman Empire, called the millet system. The government supported religious officials. And so, yes, Israel allows complete freedom of religion for Muslims, for Christians. There's a major center in Israel for the Baha'i people, who are terribly discriminated against. That is a separate religion, terribly discriminated against. I mean, there's a genocide against the Baha'i in Iran right now, unfortunately, and has been for a long time. The Baha'i are the most peaceful people. They basically believe in loving everyone, don't attack anyone. Their religion is a blend of many different religions, including Islam. The most peaceful, intellectual people you could ever imagine, and they're being slaughtered in Iran. And their main world center is in Haifa, in Israel. So yes, any type of Christian, any type of Jew, any type of Muslim, mostly Sunni, some Shia, all are welcome in Israel to practice their religion.
And going off that, so with marriage, is it the same?
No, there are problems with marriage in Israel, unfortunately, but I think they're being addressed. In Israel, to this point, you cannot have a civil ceremony. So if you want to get married in a non-religious ceremony, you have to go abroad. A lot of Israelis just go to Cyprus. It's a quick hop to Cyprus, get married, and come right back. And look, Palestinians could do something like that. They could set up a business where you wouldn't even have to get in a plane. You could go into the West Bank and get married in a civil ceremony. They could make money that way, but they don't do that. The problem is that when Israel was founded, there was the religious Jewish community in Europe had been almost completely massacred. There were very, very few of them left, in part because they thought God would protect them, and so they didn't flee when they should have and could have. And so they especially Lithuania was a great center of Jewish religious learning, and they were slaughtered. And so this little remnant of religious Jews in Israel were given special treatment in order so that they could rebuild communities. So they were subsidized by the state. Not just rabbis, but students were subsidized by the state. There were yeshivas that were subsidized. And unfortunately, this never changed. And they grew in numbers a great deal. In the United States, for instance, ultra-Orthodox have to work. Nobody's subsidized. And there's nothing, they can work and be ultra-Orthodox. But in Israel, you don't have to. Many of them do not work. And they've increased in numbers to the point where they are often the balance of power politically. They're not the majority, but there's a split between left and right. And so they end up holding a balance of power. And it can be very hard in Israel to form a government without the religious parties or some of the religious parties being part of that government. Governments in Israel have tended, unfortunately, to be coalitions, very unwieldy coalitions. No party in Israel has ever won a majority. Never. No party has ever won a majority that could govern by itself. In the early days, the Labor Party was winning 55, 56 seats, and so they could choose their coalition partners and they were in control. It's basically one-party rule. But these days, if you get 33 seats in a 120-seat parliament, you're doing pretty well, which means you can't form a government without a lot of coalition partners, including the religious. And that gives them a lot of control. And they want control over who was a Jew. The question of who gets counted as a Jew. This is a big problem, for instance, with the big Russian immigration into Israel. Some of those people had intermarried a great deal. They didn't follow Jewish customs, but they were Jewish and they came to Israel. And do they get to be considered to be Jewish? And for instance, say one of those Jewish guys wants to marry an Israeli Jewish woman. Well, the rabbis could say, well, you're not really Jewish. You have to go through a conversion ceremony so that we know you're Jewish. And they can't have a civil ceremony in Israel. If they have a civil ceremony in Cyprus, that is recognized by the Israeli state. So then they're married. It's fine. But they can't do that in Israel right now. A lot of people hope there could be like a coalition between left and right that would not need the religious parties and would change all these laws. But it almost happened, but it hasn't happened. So that's the situation. So as of yet, no civil ceremonies. It's mostly a problem for Jews. It's not a problem for Muslims or Christians. It's mostly a problem for Jews.
Okay, great. Offhand, do you know any Palestinian leader who has genuinely expressed the want for peace?
There have been Palestinian leaders who have said that. Unfortunately, they usually have to flee for their life or they get killed. Because right now, the people who have power are the people with guns. That means the Palestinian Authority, which is really the PLO, which doesn't support peace and certainly wouldn't agree to somebody going against them and trying to grab power. And of course, Hamas is out of the question. I mean, just the other day, there was some claim that Hamas had accepted a two-state solution. And every time I see this happen, I always say, wait a day. Some Hamas leader in Arabic will say, no, 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 we don't agree to that. So sure enough, that's what happened. Like the day after, there was an announcement in English that Hamas accepts a two-state solution. The next day in Arabic, they said, not a chance, forget about it. So until there's an Arab leader who will accept living in peace with Israel, until there's an, Sadat is the leader of Egypt who made peace with Israel. I should say very quickly, he deserves a lot of credit. But it actually started with the Israeli leader Menachem Begin. It's just a little piece of Israeli history. Begin was elected prime minister in 77. He broke the hold of the Labor Party from 48 to 77. It was always the Labor Party. Begin finally broke that hold, and Likud got elected. And he was presented with intelligence that there was going to be a Libyan-sponsored terrorist attack to try to kill Sadat of Egypt. And Begin asked his foreign minister, Moshe Dayan, the famous Israeli general who was foreign minister, well, what do we usually do when we get information like this? And he said, well, usually we turn it over to the Americans. The Americans turn it over to the Egyptians as if it were American intelligence. The Egyptians then owe the Americans, and the Americans then owe us. And Begin said, why not tell them directly? Why should we go through the Americans? So Morocco always played this sort of intermediary role between Israel and the other Arab states. So Moshe Dayan went to Morocco, under the auspices of King Hassan, and there was a meeting with the Egyptian defense minister. And he presented the evidence. The Egyptians checked out the evidence. It was true. They quashed the attempted assassination attempt. They also launched an incursion into Libya to make the Libyans pay. That was really the start of the peace process between Israel and Egypt. Sadat was then interviewed by Walter Cronkite. Some of you may have heard of Walter Cronkite. He was the most famous and leading Israeli American television journalist. He was interviewing Sadat, and he said, well, what would you do to make peace? And Sadat said, I would do anything. I would even go to the Knesset in Jerusalem if it saves the life of one Egyptian soldier. Well, this was a revolution. It was pre-planned, but it was a revolution. And so in those days, you didn't have great communication, but CBS was able to reach Begin in an hour or two. And Begin said, I welcome him. He's welcome to come. And I would like to come address the Egyptian parliament in Cairo. And Sadat said, yes. And that was the start of the peace process. So when there's a Palestinian Sadat who is willing to take the risks for peace, you will see a massive movement for peace in Israel. Right now, it doesn't exist. The pro-peace parties have been discredited by what happened after Camp David in 2000 and the terrible terrorism that Israel faced. But that would change on it it would turn on a dime if there were a peace partner among the Palestinians. Unfortunately, we're still waiting.
Okay, yeah, we have a few more questions. What claims do Jews have to the land of Israel?
Well, Jews have the greatest claims to the land of Israel. They are the Aboriginal people. They are the original inhabitants that still exist. You go back in history, of course, and I'm not using the Bible as a land deed, but you go back in history, there's no question about Jewish presence in the land going back thousands of years. The other people at that time who existed don't exist anymore. The Philistines, for instance, the ancient enemies of the Jews, they're long gone. They vanished in history. The Arabs, however, let's put it this way: in the original, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, I don't like to use that term, but in the Tanakh, in the Torah, there were no Arabs. Many people don't realize this. The Arabs are from Arabia. The Arabs didn't spread very much from Arabia until the advent of Muhammad, which is after 600 AD. So thousands of years after the Jewish state, the Jewish kingdoms, the Bible, King Solomon, King David, etc., thousands of years after that history, Muhammad unified the Arab tribes in what is today Saudi Arabia, what was then Arabia, and they burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and had a huge string of conquest and conquered all the Arab countries. What is today Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, was not an Arab country. Libya, let's look at the countries in Africa, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, Sudan. They're in Africa. How are they Arab countries? They're in a different continent. They were conquered. They were conquered by the Arabs. And then, of course, there was an attempt by the Arabs to conquer Europe. They crossed over where Morocco is, over to Gibraltar, and tried to conquer Europe, and in fact occupied Portugal and much of Spain for hundreds of years. And so if the Jews don't have rights to Israel, the Arabs certainly don't, because the Jewish presence in Israel long predated that of the Arabs. However, having said that, I'm not someone who says that the Arabs have no rights. On the contrary, I want to live in peace, and I want Israel to live in peace with the Palestinians and all the Arabs. I don't say that because the Jews were there first and the Arabs only came much, much later and by conquest. I don't say that that means that the Arabs don't have rights. They've been there for a very long time, and I'd love for them simply to live in peace. But the Jewish rights long predate the Arab rights and are much, much deeper than the Arab rights to the land.
Okay, this will be our last question. So in my experience in speaking with Arab Muslims that immigrate to America, they agree that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not at the top of the list. Do you think that American Jews overindulge in the issue?
Yes, I think so. I think American Jews, being mostly progressive, make the same mistake that progressives in this country make, which is thinking that, I mean, look, that without Palestinian peace with Israel, they would never be peace with the Arabs. And there's this, and maybe you've seen it, there's this infamous video with John Kerry from a few years ago in which he was being interviewed. And he said, some Israelis say that they can make peace with the Arabs without making peace with the Palestinians. And he said, no, 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 and no. That's what I say to my Israeli friends. There can never be peace with the Arabs until there's peace with the Palestinians. Well, talk about something that didn't age well, right? I mean, he made a fool of himself. And so look it up. I'm sure it hasn't been banned from YouTube. Look up John Kerry saying no, 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 and no. And this was like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, he said this. He was already out of, this was during the Trump administration. So yes, people overestimate the importance of the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. And I think one of the ways that will actually help bring peace is if people have a realistic view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and where it stands, right? With Israel having relations with the Arabs, Israel is then invested in its relations with the Arabs and maintaining its relations with the Arabs. The Arabs have said, we're not going to be deterred from peace with Israel because the Palestinians refuse to make peace. On the other hand, they certainly want the Palestinians to make peace and to live in peace with Israel. They certainly, I mean, it's not like they don't care about the Palestinians, they're just not willing to put it at the top of the list. So between the Israelis and their Arab allies, I think there is a much greater chance for peace, especially because the Palestinians may think if the Arabs are on the side of the Israelis, we have no chance of destroying Israel. That's just a pipe dream now. If we start a war with Israel, the Arabs are not going to intervene and save us, which is what the Palestinians thought in 48. They thought if they started a bloody war with Israel, the Arabs would come in and rescue them and end Israel. Well, it didn't work out that way. And now where there's no hope of the Arabs coming, the only hope they have is Iran, right? Which is why the JCPOA and resurrecting that deal is such a blow to the peace process. It really makes peace between Israel and the Palestinians much harder because it gives the Palestinians, again, this extremist hope that they can destroy Israel with Iranian help. Once that hope is gone, maybe they'll become more realistic and they'll say, look, let's just make a deal, right? Let's make a deal. There was a funny saying, Bernard Lewis used to point this out, about how difficult it was for the Arabs to make peace with Israel. And he would say that the Arabs are a martial people. They understand that there's war and there are fortunes of war and that you can lose sometimes. But to the Jews, to lose a war to the Jews, that was unacceptable back in 1948, which is why there was no peace at that time. They couldn't believe, because their propaganda about the Jews is the Jews were weak, the Jews were cowardly, the Jews would never fight, they would run away. They believed their own propaganda about what the Jews were like. And so they believed their own propaganda. And so that, in fact, helped lead to their defeat because they didn't take the Jews seriously. Now they've come to accept that Israel is a reality, that the Israelis are fierce fighters, and maybe Israel can protect them from the Iranians. So that having been said, there's a real chance for peace without the JCPOA. With the JCPOA and funding Iran and cutting the sanctions, it's going to make peace much more difficult.
Well, if you want,
I'll take more questions. I have no time limit. So as long as people want to ask questions, I'm here for you.
Okay, great. Andrew said he would like to ask, what do you think of how the previous admin handled the issues of the Middle East and Israel? What did he do wrong? What could he have done better?
Well, I think actually, obviously the previous administration made a lot of mistakes, but I think with regard to the Middle East policy, I think it was mostly correct. After all, he accomplished something which, all these so-called experts thought was impossible. They said it couldn't be done, right? They said it couldn't be done. They said, if you move the embassy, the US embassy to Jerusalem, that will open the gates of hell. That will cause riots all over the Middle East. We'll have attacks on American embassies. People will be killed. That's what all the experts said. Because, there was a law passed many, many years ago, the Jerusalem Embassy Relocation Act, which was passed by the Congress and signed by the president, that said that we should move the embassy to Jerusalem, but there was a waiver. The president, I think every 6 months, could certify that it wasn't a good time and it would be waived. And every president would say, yes, I will move the embassy to Jerusalem, and then none of them did. And Trump said, yes, I'll move the embassy to Jerusalem, and then he did. And what happened? Nothing. No attacks on American embassies, no rioting, no wars, no nothing. The experts were wrong. The experts said without a peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians, there would never be peace between Israel and the rest of the Arab states. They were totally wrong. So I think by going against the so-called experts, ignoring the experts, I hope the Trump policies have taught some lessons, some valuable lessons to people. And to some it has. To some of the so-called experts who turned out to be wrong, they have admitted that the Trump policies really were a good idea, were prescient and worked, and that they learned something. Other people, I think, will never learn. I'm not sure John Kerry's ever going to learn, but some of the other people did learn. So I think when it came to the Middle East policies, I think they were quite good. I think they were quite successful.
Great. If you have any just closing remarks, just to share with the University of Miami community, that would be awesome.
Well, I would just say again that the most important thing is don't let Israel be demonized. Don't let Israel be demonized. Always say compared to what? That's not whataboutism. Whataboutism is itself whataboutism, if you think about it. Accusing somebody of whataboutism, that's whataboutism itself. So always compare Israel, always make real world comparisons. Say Israel is bad, compared to who? Compared to what? Right? Compared to perfect standards? Well, everybody's bad compared to perfect standards, right? You love your parents? Are your parents perfect? No. Okay, well, why do you love your parents then, right? You love your friends? They're not perfect. So why does Israel have to be perfect alone among countries? Why is Israel held to be held to these standards? So never, never allow, this is what they always do. They try to hold Israel standards of perfection, international law, which nobody else follows. And so I use the argument that Israel follows international law more than any other country in similar circumstances, right? And the thing to do is to compare Israel not to Norway at peace, but to Britain, for instance, at war, or to Canada when they were under pressure from Quebec separatists. And it's old history and nobody remembers it, but when Canada was facing a real terrorist threat and politicians were being kidnapped and killed by Quebec separatists, the Canadian government suspended habeas corpus, started arresting people with no judicial permission at all, with no charges. And so, that's what countries do under stress, even democracies, even Canada. Under stress, they don't follow the usual rules. And yet Israel is supposed to follow rules that nobody else is supposed to follow. Don't allow that to happen. Always portray Israel as it really is, as a multicultural democracy, which has Arab ambassadors, which has Arab judges, which has many, many Arab doctors. The Israeli healthcare system would collapse without Israeli Arab doctors and pharmacists and physical therapists. It would absolutely collapse without them. That's the reality of Israel. The people who criticize Israel mostly have never been there and have this vision of Israel that has nothing to do with reality. Israel shares water with it, even with its enemies, even with Gaza. Israel shares water because they've done it for so many years. They don't want to cut them off. It's amazing. I think it's crazy, but that's what they do. That's the real Israel. So make sure that the real Israel is portrayed. Don't let them get away with the lies.
Great. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And